Good morning. I'm Dr. Wally Taylor from Texas Integrative Wellness, and I wanted to talk for a little bit just now about individual sensitivity to environmental toxins. In my experience of about 40 years of treating people with chronic illness due to exposure to environmental toxins, I've learned that I have to focus on three things. First, I have to focus on the actual toxins themselves. And in any individual with chronic illness, I find that it's a combination of toxin exposures, which might include biological toxins like germs and viruses, chemical toxins, heavy metal toxins, and even now physical toxins such as from electromagnetic frequency, Wi-Fi computers, and high voltage power lines. But it turns out the second thing that I have to focus on in my patients that I see is the fact that everyone has their own personal individual sensitivity to these environmental toxins. We see a spectrum, like a bell curve. And at one end of the spectrum are the highly sensitive individuals. I call them the canaries in the coal mine, because the coal miners used to carry canaries down in the coal mine with them because they knew they were so sensitive to toxic environmental mine gases that they could keep an eye on the canary who would tip them off to when there was a dangerous situation. So at the other end of the spectrum of bell curve from the canaries in the coal mine are the other folks that are very, very resistant to toxins, and then the most of the population that's somewhere in between. But I've learned over the years that there's a lot of different ways that we can identify who's going to be a canary in the coal mine. There are factors that we can look for that explain that, and really, even more importantly, the fact that we've learned that we can shift a person on that bell curve of sensitivity away from the highly sensitive canary in the coal mine end toward those lucky folks that are really resistant. And then, of course, the last thing that I've learned to really focus on is the role of stress in the brain, particularly the limbic system brain, in terms of its ability, if it gets stuck in the fight or flight or fear, sympathetic hypersensitivity, that it can then in turn generate lots of these symptoms of chronic illness. But today I'm going to focus on that second feature, the fact that everyone has different individual sensitivities. So if you were to ask me, what are some ways that we can identify who has the greatest individual sensitivity? I would tell you that the first thing that we should look at and consider is a person's genetics. Of course, we're born with 23 pairs of chromosomes and about 23,000 different genes that can code for proteins. Now, the proteins in our body, each are unique chains of amino acids that are determined by these genes. Well, if we always get one copy of each gene, one from mother and one from father, and depending on the status of those genes, sometimes they define abnormalities of the sequences of amino acids in these proteins, which causes the proteins to behave differently than they should, or what we call the wild type. So we now have capabilities through good gene testing. I personally, in my office, use a saliva gene testing, functional genomic analysis that looks at literally hundreds of these gene variations, which we call SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms. And that then generates us a very extensive report that can show many of the genetic predispositions that would define increased sensitivity to various environmental toxins. Now, the genes themselves are kind of like recipes in a cookbook. I always tell my patients that a gene is a theoretical expression of what their proteins would look like, but genes are only active if they're being expressed. In other words, if they're being translated into proteins. It's kind of like if you have a really good recipe to cook a meal, but you don't cook the meal, you still don't get to enjoy the good meal. And the flip side of that coin is that you can have a very good recipe for a meal and yet not be able to cook it well. Maybe you don't have a good stove, or you don't have the right ingredients, or you don't have good pots and pans, or you're just not a good cook. So you can have the best recipes in the world, best genes in the world, and still not have a very good metabolism. So there's a lot of different ways that we can assess a person's individual metabolism, or their ability to be resistant to resistant to toxins. But I would say that some of the factors involved there would be clearly the immune system. Our genes, of course, code for many features of our immune system, but the immune system is extremely complicated. It has over 200 different cell types, and it has literally hundreds of different signaling molecules, many of them peptides and proteins, but also many other smaller signaling molecules and effector molecules. Of course, the immune system's tasked with the job of trying to identify, sequester, suppress, and eliminate a whole variety or host of foreign invaders in the body. The interesting thing is that when the immune system does that, it generates what we call an immune reaction or an immune response. This is when the immune system aggressively is fighting back. And many times, as it does this, the immune system releases certain mediators that can be toxic, not only to the foreign invaders, but also to our cells. So it turns out the immune system can actually cause a certain amount of the symptoms of chronic illness that we see, what I call immune self-injury. And I tell people it's like friendly fire in a war. But we can actually assess many of the markers of the immune system, most of those through either blood testing or stool testing. But we look for things like the populations of the lymphocytes of the patients. We look for the presence of certain markers that are called cytokines, lymphokines, interleukins. We can look at some of the effector molecules of the immune system as well. The other thing that we like to do is the organic acids test, which is a urine test, which looks at a number of metabolic markers in the urine. And when we compare these various metabolic markers to normals, we can identify where patients are going to have some difficulty that might present as increased sensitivity to these various environmental toxins. In addition, we can also look at factors regarding the hormone system of the body, which is often adversely affected in environmental toxic illness. But we can measure hormones, and we can measure the body's response to hormones. Now, depending on what we see when we do these various assessments of environmental sensitivity, whether it be genetic or by actually looking at the functions of the body itself, there's many different ways that we can intermediate. We can talk about dietary changes that can change a person's sensitivity, lifestyle changes, exercise, getting more sleep and better sleep. We can also talk about the nutrient status of the patient, and there's actually good ways that we can assess the body for actual nutrient efficiency or sufficiency. So these are just a few of the things that I do to assess my patient's individual sensitivity to environmental toxins, at the same time that I'm also focusing on the toxins themselves and how to, number one, avoid exposure to further toxins, and number two, how do I assist my patients in elimination of the toxins from their body. And simultaneously with that, we also focus on stress and the limbic system's role in generation of symptoms and how we can best deal with that part of the patient's chronic complex illness. So hopefully this has been a little bit helpful to learn a little bit about the focus that I have on individual sensitivity, why that's so important, and why that is something that we can definitely change for people in a way that makes them recover from chronic illness and be much more resistant to chronic illness, which is, of course, also a way that we can really help people focus on longevity and wellness, which is a couple of things that I'm very, very interested and passionate about. So I hope you like the video. If you do, please consider following me on my YouTube channel, my Facebook page. Please feel free to share the video with your friends and family. And I look forward to meeting you in the future. If you'd like to see me in my clinic, you can contact us at texasintegrative.com. My practice is in Austin, Texas. So have a blessed day.